Thank you, Craig. So today's session is, it's actually right in the middle of the whole year's program that I planned out, and it is the most crucial, this one and next week's, 2 weeks from now when we do the next class. These are the crucial two that take us through the process that brought us to what we are today. So up until now, we focused on first Torah with Tamar, and then we looked at Tanakh and the development of it when we looked at Shimshon at Samson. And then we moved into the Kings period, the Judges period right before the Kings with the daughter of Jephthah. Then we moved into the Kings period when we dealt with Gedaliah. And now we're about to go into what becomes the Mishnaic period or the Tanaitic period. A Tana is a rabbinic voice that really is part of the Mishnah period. Mishnah and before is called a Tana. After the Mishnah, it's called an Amora. That's the Amoraic period, and that's the Talmud. We'll deal with that next week, 2 weeks from now. So we're going to focus on, in effect, how did that brilliant group of human beings, most of them we still don't know much about, and it's murky how it started, but how they arrived at remolding and reshaping what had been a biblical form of Judaism that worked more or less well for at least 1,000 years or so, from the first temple through the destruction of the second temple, how they molded what was left into something that would then last 2,000 years, that lost all of the founding organizations. All of the biblical organizations were lost. They were destroyed. They were put out of work. The Kohanim, the priests, the Levites, no more prophets, no more kings, no more tribal leaders. All of the biblical forms, everything wasn't suddenly, but over a period of hundreds of years was gone. And there was none of it left. The temple was gone. Jerusalem had been taken over and was occupied. They had to figure out, is there a future for that people? And these were individuals that knew the stories of the Bible. And that's important because they knew that all of the peoples who had lived in the Bible had disappeared. They knew there were no Philistines around in their day and age. They knew there were no more Hittites. There were no Jebusites. All of the nations that they read about in their stories, they knew were gone. So they knew that this Hebrew people could just as easily be gone, could disappear just as easily as the others had. And they had to find a way to reshape whatever they could to make something cohesive for this people that were now spread throughout the Middle East. We lived under them. We lived in both Israel, the land itself, Judea, Israel. We lived in Babylonia, which was now Persia. We lived up in the area near Turkey, and Lebanon. We lived in part of Egypt, and we were spreading out into Rome and Greece. So we had settlements in all of those areas. And very soon we would have settlements in what became Spain, eventually what became England, what became Germany, all of Europe. As Rome spread, Jews spread with Romans. And so as Rome began to conquer all different territories, Jews went with them. So these rabbis, these individuals who weren't always called rabbis, we talked about that last time, like Hillel was not called rabbi, but he was a precursor of that group. They had to figure it out. So we're going to look at, among others, we're going to look, the first one we're going to look at is Akiba. It's a name you know. He's a key individual in this whole process. And he's fascinating both from his own biography, and he's fascinating because of what he did in order to help make that transition. So let me share a little of his story. There we are. Bobby, is that large enough for you to read, or we need it bigger? You got to unmute, Bobby, if you're going to read. Yeah, well, there you go.
Okay. I said I'll put on my glasses. Probably see it better. Okay, you can leave it small. Okay, early life. Akiba was an uneducated shepherd until the age of 30. He began studying Torah with the encouragement and heroic support of his wife, Rachel, the daughter of a wealthy Jerusalemite who agreed to marry him if he devoted himself to learning Torah. Akiba was committed but doubted his ability. He was inspired by the sight of a rock hollowed out by the steady dripping of water. If water, which is soft, could wear away a hard stone, surely the words of Torah, which are as hard as iron, can make an impression on my soft heart. Akiva was a Tana, one of the initial teachers of the Mishnah in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era.
Okay, just a second, Bobby. So I just want to make sure you see the word. I talked about it before. This is the Tanaitic period. Tanas is the name, the generic name given to all of those who were involved in the creation of the Mishnah, not the Talmud, but the Mishnah. The Mishnah precedes the Talmud. Is everybody clear on that and understand that? Does anybody have a question about that? Yes, Roger.
So the Mishnah is the oral tradition.
Well, everything is the oral tradition that is not the Tanakh. If you take out the Tanakh, which is the revealed text as we understand it, everything else is oral. Written law, or the written Torah, is the Tanakh, right? After that, everything is the oral law, including everything we read today. Everything that comes after is called oral law or oral Torah, right? Even though it's written now and has been written. In fact, the Mishnah got written at the end of the Tanaitic period around the year 220 of the Common Era. So from that time on, even the oral Torah was a written Torah, but it still was called oral Torah to distinguish it from the revelation of the Tanakh.
So,
yeah.
Well, no, it's a little confusing. So Akiva had some writings that he could refer to.
He knew the stories, and he had the Torah. He had the prophets. He had, by his time, he had the writings. He also had other texts that were written. For instance, we know, you remember the story of the great library of Alexandria.
Sure, burned down.
Right. So we know there were great areas of libraries of texts, and our people, we know the Dead Sea Scrolls, which precede Akiba by about 200 years. And they had scrolls, we found them, right? So we know there were scrolls at the time that were written. But when Akiba is looking at them, he understands the difference between the written Torah, which is the Tanakh, and the oral Torah, which is everything after, including what was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found the book of Isaiah. They found a lot of the books of the Tanakh, but they also found other texts. Those would have been considered, the other texts would have been considered oral law, but it was never accepted. Some of it was accepted, some wasn't. As I said last time, the book of the Maccabees did not make it into oral Torah, oral law, right? It was not considered legitimate by our people, even though it existed. And it was written 200 years before Akiba. Is that clear?
Yes.
It's a label, Roger. And if you think of the label, everything after the book of Malachi, the prophet, the end of our Tanakh, that's it. That's the end of written law. Everything else that follows is oral. Okay?
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, but we divide it into different eras. So the early era is called the Tanaitic, and that's the word that the rabbi would be called of that period. Akiba was a Tana, right? And you know the word in the Ve'ahavta, V'shinantam levanecha, teach them to your children. Tana is an Aramaic term like Shana, V'shinantam. So it means a teacher, a Tana. But it only refers to the earlier period, okay? First and second century, basically, is the period we're talking. And Akiba lived during that time. Okay, any other questions as we move on? Okay, Bobby, you want to?
Okay, sure. During the destruction of the Second Temple, 70 CE, sages under the leadership of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai fled to Yavne to establish an academy of Torah learning. Rabbi Yochanan passed the leadership to Rabban Gamliel. Akiba went to Yavne and studied under two of Rabban Gamliel's students, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, and Nahum ish Gamzu.
Okay, let's talk a little about him. So Akiba is 30 years old. The story is that he was like a sharecropper on the fields of this very wealthy man. And the wealthy man's daughter, Rachel, used to go out in the fields, and she met him, and she was impressed by his intelligence. He was illiterate. He was an illiterate sharecropper, but she was really intrigued by him, and the two of them ostensibly fell in love. And Rachel went to her father and said, I want to marry this guy. And he said, are you out of your mind? You're the daughter of a wealthy person. I can have you marry the great rabbi's great rabbi's son. And she said, but I love him, and he's going to be a great thinker. He's going to be a great rabbi. And the father was very angry. He disowned her. She and Akiba got married. She only, according to the stories, and this is in the Mishnah and the Talmud, Rachel only agreed to marry Akiba if he would go and study. She would work to pay for his studies. He agreed, and he went and studied, and it took him a long time. It took him about 20 years. And she did things like sold her hair to make money. She worked in the fields. She, she was really a devoted wife. And he became this great rabbi, really one of the great rabbis of the entire Mishnah. And he studied in that first yeshiva in Yavne that was established right after the temple was destroyed. So he was the first generation of students in that very core group. That was the beginning of this process. We don't know exactly how they came to these ideas, but we have records of some of their decisions. And those decisions really were the Mishnah, eventually. But the Mishnah has to go through the 2nd century still. Every one of these names, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabban Gamliel, Akiba, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania, Nahum ish Gamzu, these are all huge figures in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. These are great founders of what became Mishnaic, the Mishnah, Mishnaic Judaism, what we became. And there are many more, because this is only the first 30 years. Akiba will die in the year 133 or so. And then there's still another 70 or more years until the Mishnah is compiled. So there's 2 centuries of rabbis like this who will work on all of these ideas and shape what we now know as Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism. Is that clear? Questions, comments? Okay, so let's go to his teachings. It says that Akiba was considered a successor, but there's a problem. And we're gonna understand that problem as we go on. Akiba's background is not clear. There is some confusion in the Talmud about him, whether he was from a conversionary family or not. It's not clear whether he converted to Judaism. But it's very clear that he didn't come from any of the classical Tanakh lines like David or the priests. He didn't come from any of those lines. And that will become important as this process, as the story unfolds. Okay. Let's do his teachings.
Okay. Akiba was the first rabbi to declare that the entire Torah came directly from heaven and taught the concept of Hakaras Hatov. A person should always say, whatever the All-Merciful does is for the good.
Okay. He's the first one to state it. We don't know if he came up with it, right? We only know that he's the earliest source we have for the line that says that the Torah is from God, right? The entire Torah is from God. That's something we have under Akiba. We didn't have it stated before. Hillel didn't say it. Shammai didn't say it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai didn't say it. Akiba did. So we can already see that by the end of the 1st century, which is when Akiba is really reaching the height of his influence, at this point, that notion is now taking shape, and that God is all merciful and only acts out of goodness. Right? These are principles that will begin to take part of the rest of the Mishnah. Yes, Ben.
Two questions are not related. One is, isn't it remarkable though that seeing the whole of Israel and all the tribes demolished, and the judges defeated and the kings go down, how could they come to that conclusion that everything's good and merciful? I mean, it's somewhat rhetorical question, But I mean, these are geniuses. These are people of great thinking. How can you even begin to think that when you see your nation going in the toilet?
Well, and you and I probably wouldn't come to that.
Yeah.
But I think what they recognized was you've got to give the people hope, got to give them some reason to stay Jewish. And they've got to believe that God has a plan. And they don't understand it.
Yeah.
None of us understand it, but that plan is from an all-merciful God, which means there's a purpose in all of this.
Got it.
And we serve a purpose. You know, part of shaping this was how do we give them a foundation, some way of understanding everything they've lost and still believing that they have a reason to affirm their revealed text and their God.
Yeah, that's a good answer as any.
Well, and then they had to also figure out, and what do we give them to do? Because they can't go to the temple anymore. They have no king. They're not on the land. They're all over the place. What do we give them to do that will make them feel connected to this all-merciful God who has a plan? And that's the unfolding of the law that they will derive from the Tanakh and shape into the Mishnah.
And the second question is again, these folks I have a superficial understanding of the Tanakh, whatever I studied as a young man. And even I know that there's horrible conflicts, like in the book of Noah, two of each animal, 7 of each animal, 7 days, 40 days. If they had the opportunity to put together the canon, how could they say this thing was handed down from God and it was infallible? I mean, how they know far more than I do. And even with my understanding, I realize there's so much conflict and confusion.
Okay, so they also came up with certain principles about the Tanakh. One, it is the revelation from God, all of it. 2, there can be no contradiction in the Tanakh. That's a principle, meaning every single thing that looks like a contradiction is only because we don't understand it. There are no contradictions in the Tanakh. In a sense, it's the principle of science, right? When during the 19th century, when they were observing the various problems with the theories of the movement of the planets, they knew there was something wrong because the movement did not adhere to the theory. So they came up with different ideas. One of them was the planet Vulcan. I mean, they had a number until Einstein came and explained about gravity and the nature of what acts on bodies in space. But science says there can't be a conflict. You have to resolve the conflict. Well, that's what they said about the Tanakh. There's got to be a resolution that God has placed in there, and we've just got to work at it and figure it out. So these are assumptions they came up with. They came up with the assumption as well that everything that can be derived legitimately from the Tanakh was intended to give us meaning. So if we can figure it out, it will help us understand what God wants us to do. Because God has chosen us, and the secrets of it are all in there. And remember, they came up with a 4-part way of understanding everything in the Tanakh. They called it Pardes. You've all heard, I know you've studied it before. The simple meaning, the Peshat, the Remez, the hint, the Drash, the Midrash, and the Sod, the secret. So every aspect of it can be derived from the Tanakh because the Tanakh is the revelation. Everything we're doing flows from that. Okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay,
let's continue.
Okay. Rabbi Akiva's philosophy captured the partnership between man and God that is central to Judaism. everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is given.
Wait a minute. How is that possible? Isn't that an oxymoronic sentence? If everything is foreseen, how can freedom of choice be given?
You'd have to be God to keep track of it all.
Well, one way of understanding it is that we live in a conflicted world, and we are conflicted. But we hold that freedom of choice is given. Otherwise, there's no such thing as sin. You can't sin if God has foreseen your act, right? If God already destined you to make this kind of a judgment, there's no sin. It's God decided. On the other hand, this belief that Akiba formulated, God foresees everything. Now you could say, but that means that you have freedom of choice, but God understands how you will choose. Not that God has directed you, but God understands you well enough to know how you will choose. And so you're not a puppet on a string, but God is understanding of you, so has a deep understanding of you and knows what your inclinations are. But that principle is part of the core principles that Akiba promoted and is part of our core tradition. What else did he say?
The world is judged with goodness, yet everything depends on the abundance of good deeds.
Okay,
Now,
what does that mean?
Rabbi Charles has his hand up.
Go ahead, Charles.
It seems to me that sort of the fundamental thing about, the Mishnah and what we're talking about is the fact that this group of people said, we can sort of take control of our lives and try to, in the way we live, the way we interact with people, in the way we talk to people, in the way we do things, it's important. It has importance. And, it gets into that thing we just read. We have freedom to do those choices. And it's important because every person wakes up every morning, right? And we're hungry, we have to eat, we have to make food, we have to do those things, right? Everybody does that. That's just human, that's biological, right? We have to, survive, right? That's survival. So what's the difference here? The difference here is this is a group of people that said, we're not just trying to survive, we're trying to live a life that's better, more pure, more something, right? And more godly, or whatever, you can fill in the blanks. And then they started saying, all right, what are the rules that we need to follow? So the Torah, the Tanakh already has 613 rules to follow, basic rules. And during that time, they had Moses and they had the Kohanes to give them answers if they need it. Now they're saying, well, we don't have them anymore. Moses isn't there. The Kohen aren't there. So we have to start. And it's amazing that they even, obviously the answers are amazing, but what's even more amazing to me is the question, just even asking that question that caused them to give these answers is amazing, right? Because it would have been, I don't know, I'm not really asking a question. I'm just sort of
Right, I understand.
comment, but
No, and you're right. You're right. There, at the same time that this was happening, that was the beginning of Christianity. And,
right.
And it began among Jews, basically, who said, everything's lost. This philosophy, this new philosophy that Paul started to teach, roughly at the same time, right after the temple was destroyed, Paul was saying, you don't need to offer sacrifices. All you have to do is believe in God sacrificing this lamb and our sins will be forgiven. You don't have to go to the temple anymore. So Christianity was another answer to the desperation of the loss of everything among Jews. And those philosophies impacted eventually, obviously, the Roman Empire. But Judaism's philosophy, the way the rabbis took it, was not as appealing as the way Paul and the other writers of the Gospels eventually evolved it over time, and the early fathers of the church. They were able to evolve it in a way that was much more appealing and allowed for things in the Roman Empire like statues, like Mary can be prayed to, all kinds of things that blended in with the Roman Empire. And so Romans found it much more accommodating. They didn't have to circumcise, right? They didn't have to keep kosher. They didn't have to give up their shellfish. They live, after all, in the Mediterranean. But that philosophy, the philosophy of Christianity, grew also out of the destruction of the temple, grew out of their own depression, right? Our answer was one answer. There were other answers. The Essenes went to the desert and rejected society. They said, we're just going to give up on society and go live in the desert by ourselves. There were a lot of answers.
The only point I just wanted to make, and then I'll be quiet, is it's fascinating to me when you think of the tractates of the Talmud, that let's say one, for instance, family. So they were concerned, like, what's the way that a husband should treat his wife, and just that very particular thing. And they thought about it and talked about it, came up with rules, and just that is amazing, right? That it was basically all of it has to do with how do we live our lives in a better way, a more just and a more ethical. Right. And it wasn't about beliefs like Christianity is about, oh, you have to believe in Jesus, believe in the afterlife, blah, blah, blah. We didn't have to believe. It's all about what do we do every day when we wake up? How do we live our life? And what rules should we follow to live that life?
Right, but don't think it was simple. We're going to see here that Akiba and the other rabbis got pushback, because part of it you can hear it in this. In just a second, here let me read this little section here. So Akiba developed a whole biblical interpretation called Midrash, and that meant that there were rules that he derived of how you could interpret the Tanakh, because you can see the people were saying to him, what are you talking about? What are you basing this on? That's not in the Bible. That's not in the Tanakh. You're telling us this stuff? Where is it? So Akiba had to, with the other rabbis, come up with a legitimate methodology that they could sell to their people that said, here's what it's based on. And it is in the Torah, and it is in the prophets, and it is in the writings, and I'll show it to you, and here's how we find it. If you take these methods, we can derive everything from the Tanakh. So there was a whole, that's why it took centuries. You can't think that suddenly everybody said, oh yes, we understand about being Jewish now. We just got to follow the Mishnah. It took hundreds of years to make that established among a sizable group of Jews who could then continue it on. And it was, at the same time, it was in conflict with other philosophies and religions going on at the same time. So this is what we inherited, because this is the part that our people chose. Now, you can argue, as the Orthodox would, this is God directed all of this. But if you want to see it more in human terms, you can see how they struggled to come and find the right answers that then would work. And they came up with lines like, if the people are not prophets, they are the son of prophets, meaning if they won't follow it, let's find another thing to follow, because they're the ones we're trying to convince, right? So look at what they're doing and see if they can teach us. This was a dialogue. This was not a group on high that were just making decisions. They were trying things out and they were debating and they were talking and looking at, are the people buying it? You know, are they doing it in their synagogues? Is the synagogue working? Okay, so let me look on a little further. This part of it, the Bar Kokhba affair really is the end of his life, and it's only of interest in the sense that we know a lot about Akiba. And we actually know a lot about him in the early days. We know about all kinds of stories about him, and about Rachel, Rachel. We know where they're buried. If you go to Tiberias, you'll see the grave of Akiba, and down the mountain a little bit, you'll see Rachel's grave. And those graves have been preserved, at least historically. We don't know. We have no DNA. We can't prove it, but that's the area they were buried in, up in Tiberias, off the Sea of Galilee. Bar Kokhba, here you have 132 to 135. So temple is destroyed in 70. Masada falls in 73. Now Rome controls everything. And during this period of 120 and after, Rome began to put very severe restrictions on the Jews and make it economically very hard for them to earn a living. The taxes became very heavy. Rome was expanding. They needed more money. They needed more material. They were demanding from their outposts more. So a group again revolted, just like we had a group revolting in 66 that ended with the temple destroyed. Another big group revolted in 132. Akiba supported the rebellion. Now, he wasn't a young guy, right? We know he wasn't a young guy because he went to that yeshiva somewhere around 80 or 90. So if he was 30 years old, so at this point, he's got to be 70, 75, maybe even 80. And in those days, that was very old. He not only supported the rebellion, he named this leader of the rebellion, his name was Bar Kokhba, the Messiah. He somehow believed at that point that Bar Kokhba was going to bring everything back, temple would be resurrected, Jews would be put back, the kingship would be restored. Now, it might be that he had little Alzheimer's at the end of his life. Well, I mean, we don't know what happened to him, but it was a little nuts to actually believe that would happen, or maybe he really believed in the miraculous notion that God is going to make it all come together, even though it looked like it couldn't happen. And most of the rabbis did not support it. It was clear they couldn't defeat the Romans. But Akiba thought there'd be a miracle. Short answer is, as we know, no miracle happened. There was mass slaughter. Akiba himself, we know how he died according to the stories that we have in the Talmud. He was burned alive with flaming red metal combs. They combed his skin until the flesh came off his skin. And then they burned him. And at the end of his life, we have that famous statement where he says the Shema as he's dying. And there are a number of little stories about it. And he was considered one of the great martyrs of our people. There were a number of martyrs during that time. Okay. Any comments at this point? Now you see what it says here about living to 120? That's a midrash. We have no real evidence that anybody lived to 120. We have that Moses lived to 120, but King David lived to 70. So this is a midrash in the Talmud. We don't know for sure how long he lived, but we do know he lived a long life. Okay, now, any comments or questions before we move into a little more history? I wanted to focus on Akiba because he was, let me go out of this for a second. He was really a core figure. The next core figure was Rabbi Meir. That's a name that's very important because Akiba began to put structure to the oral law. He gave structure to the Midrash and he gave structure to the oral law. Meir took what he did, what Akiba did, and shaped it in a much more coherent way. And everything that Judah the prince would put together in the Mishnah was based on their work. And it says in the Talmud, when the Mishnah states a law with no rabbi's name, it's according to Rabbi Meir. That's how important Meir was. Meir becomes a key person. And what's fascinating about Meir is his teacher was Elisha ben Abuya. I know it's a funny name. Elisha ben Abuya's name hardly ever appears in the Mishnah or the Talmud. Instead, they call him by his nickname. His nickname is Acher, the other one. Because Elisha ben Abuya left Judaism and became an apostate. We don't know what he believed, but we know he rejected Judaism. He rejected everything that he himself taught Rabbi Meir. Now, the famous incident where he did the rejection happened, according to the Talmud. The man named Acher was sitting around on Shabbos doing what you're supposed to do, studying, praying, and he saw an incident that was the straw that broke his faith. A person did what he was told to do. He went up to a tree. He saw a bird and a nest of eggs. He shooed away the mother. He took the eggs, and as he was getting down from the tree, he fell and broke his neck. And Elisha ben Abuya said, there is no judge and there is no justice. Now, it obviously was a culmination of a lot of things he had seen. And he finally had it and said, there's no God and there's no justice in the world. Akiba, Meir, you guys, I know you believe it. I'm done. Now, what's fascinating is Meir never stopped listening and learning from his teacher until his teacher died. And the rabbis criticized him, but they also understood. They said he opened the pomegranate and got rid of the shell and only took what was inside it. Meaning he took the essence of what Acher taught, but he didn't follow what Acher did. So there are a lot of stories about them, but the ultimate answer is that out of this period came the Mishnah. The Mishnah was formed around 220, as I said, of the Common Era. It was promulgated by Rabbi Judah Hanasi, Judah the Prince. Judah was a descendant of, remember Yochanan ben Zakkai? Right? He set up Yavne. Gamliel came after him. Well, everybody who came after them was descended from that person, from Yochanan. And Yochanan was, according to the Mishnah and Talmud, descended from King David. That's why I said Akiba could not ascend to the head of the Sanhedrin. Because they believe that in order to get the people, I think this is my reading, in order to get the people to follow all of this, they also needed to anchor it in the Tanakh. So how do you anchor it in the Tanakh? You anchor it in God's chosen king, who was anointed by Samuel the prophet, right? And his descendant will be the Messiah. So our system is headed by his descendant. He's not a king, but his lineage is from David, chosen by God and connecting us to the Messiah. So Akiba may have said Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, but the reality is they anchored the system, this whole system, in this Sanhedrin, this body of rabbis, and they had the head of it always to be connected to David, at least through the Mishnah. Judah Hanasi was the one who compiled it. He was wealthy. He was connected to Rome. He studied in Rome. He knew the Roman leadership. And he was Yochanan ben Zakkai's descendant. So he had enough power to actually publish, if you will, what we call the Mishnah. He didn't do it alone, did it with a whole group of other rabbis that worked with him. He used Rabbi Meir's work, he used Rabbi Akiba's work, he used all the things that had been accumulating for 2 centuries. And he put it all together into this textbook. And this textbook became the formula, the constitution for how the Talmud would interpret the Tanakh. And during all of that time, there were Jews who were leaving and there were Jews who were coming. And Jews in the diaspora, they were learning about it, in Babylonia particularly, in Egypt, they were learning about these laws and this Mishnah, and they started learning it as well. And that's why eventually we have 2 Talmuds, but we'll get to that in 2 weeks. So, any questions before we go a little more? Yes, Roger.
I'm just kind of thinking that you're saying other Jews are kind of getting in on it. Jews are coming, Jews are going. But I would think that what was the real turnoff to the people that are staying with this stuff? It couldn't have been just the writings. I think a little further bit down in this lesson that you've given us, they say it was kosher and something else. It was the intangibles.
Right. It was the purification. It was the mikvah. It was family purity, right?
Yes.
Those were the practical things they came up with. And those were things that were work, but they didn't work for everybody. All I'm saying is, for the people that it worked for, the core obviously was a big enough core. We don't know what the numbers were, but we know it was a big enough group that adhered to what they were saying and that made sense to them, so that group was there to grow over time to become us, right?
Yes, but I'm thinking, what was it about the outside world that made them reject everything else that could have been offered from them?
Well, because part of it was this faith in a God that was invisible. It's an interesting notion in that world. Remember, even the Romans and the Christians needed something visible, right? They needed statues, they needed pictures. Zoroastrians in Babylonia, Persia, they needed statues as well. So this notion of this God without form, right, who was all compassionate and who had a plan, appealed to a core group. And that core group was willing to take, in effect, the abuse of the Roman Empire in order to maintain itself. You know, there was also the connection with family, just like for us. Why do Jews who marry non-Jews sometimes still remain identified as Jews, whether their children are raised as Jews or not. They do it partly because of their mother and father, their connection with their grandparents. There's a family tie, right? There's all kinds of reasons why people, it's what they learned as kids. It's what they're comfortable with. You know, kashrut was an interesting thing because they had to invent kashrut. Not what animals, but how to set your table. And they had to find a way to interpret the milk and meat thing, which we've talked about before, the milk and meat, right? They had to find a way to interpret it from an obscure 3 lines in the Tanakh, in the Torah, right? That says, don't see the kid in its mother's milk. They had to find a way to do that. Well, Akiba gave them tools to do that, right? That's part of this Mishnaic Midrash process. It wasn't just simple. So we don't know when the milk meat happened. We don't know exactly when it actually crystallized as an idea. We know they kept kosher in that they would eat certain animals and others not. But we don't know when all the nuances of it really began to become formulated. We know that by the Mishnah, a lot had happened, and we have a lot of those laws. The laws about Shabbat, what you could do for work on Shabbat, what you couldn't do. When did they get actually formulated? Because if you look at the Torah, it's not clear what work is. It has to be derived. And where do they derive it from? From the activity of building the temple, the tabernacle in the wilderness, right? Well, how did they get to that? They got to it through this process that Akiba and that Ishmael is another one who did it, that Akiba and Ishmael gave them the tools to do it and to show it in the text and to prove it to the Jewish people. So it's a process. Unless you believe that God gave it all on Sinai and just passed it on from generation to generation. For me, it's highly unlikely. I think it's more miraculous that they came up with all this and figured it out, that nobody else figured out how to keep a diaspora community somehow connected to each other without communication. They had no cell phones, but they also had they didn't even have letters. The communication was hard between Israel, Judah, and Egypt and Rome. It took weeks, months to get any message from one place to another. And yet they were able to formulate this over time and to build a structure that we now call Judaism, right? And all of that was going on in the period between the Maccabees, basically, and Judah the prince. And they were spreading different laws, they were interpreting, they were teaching, they were giving all this, and people were beginning to do it, but not everybody. We know that not everybody did it. We have a very famous person who didn't do it, a man named Josephus. Some of you may know his name. He was a general in the first rebellion in 66. He betrayed his people. He went over to the other side, to the Romans. He told the Romans a lot of the information about the Jews. He helped the Romans win the war. He became a Roman himself. He lived in Rome. He wrote books in Latin for the Roman Empire about the Jews, about our history, about a number of things. We have those books. He didn't do the laws. He didn't keep them. He didn't really identify anymore as a Jew, right? And we know others who did, who left. But we also know people who joined Judaism, including people in the Roman hierarchy. We know of different people who eventually chose Judaism we know some that chose Christianity later. This is a whole period of flux in that area. And there's a lot going on because Rome is expanding. There's a lot of energy going on. And then at a certain point, Rome stagnates. And then Rome begins to shrink. This is all going on during the period of the Talmud. Because the Talmud will take us to about the year 600-700 CE. And by then, Rome is done. Rome is overrun, and Rome has now become history. But when the Mishnah is written, Rome is at its power, right? Rome is still expanding. Rome is moving throughout Europe. Rome is moving throughout the ancient Middle East and Africa. And the Mishnah comes out of that period. Jody, you have a question? Oh, I have a meeting at 8 o'clock. I gotta go. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a good Shabbos.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Sorry.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.